So anyone that's worked in network architecture will understand what that means. Persistence pays. Now I need to see which button to push on this. The left one? Oh, good. But it goes a little bit deeper than that. But one of the things that the Persing's book goes into is the distinction between the classic and romantic sort of perspectives. Now, just a little bit of a way to think about that. This is the difference between the rational and the mystic, or between the analytical and the intuitive, or between science and art. And so one of the things I wanted to talk about today is in the context of network architecture, it really is a blending of both. And just to help you understand a little bit more about what I mean by this, I'll just go back to motorcycle maintenance a little bit. This is the classic view, and you're going to recognize it because it fits the view that I would expect 99% of you in the room to have, which is we understand systems. They're built from subsystems. No subsystems have subsystems. And we can break these things down to their smallest parts. And then we keep breaking them down further and further. Well, this is the classic view. It's the analytical view. And one of the things that I got from this book is, for the first time, I understood why I think a little bit differently than this. Because according to Persing, there's two kinds of people. Those that like to fix their motorcycles, and those that simply like to ride them. And I discovered that I was, in fact, in the second category. Yeah, there's a little bit of analysis there, and I do like to know how it works, but it really is a matter of it's fun to ride. This is the intuitive, the romantic, the mystical aspect or perspective. Well, Persing doesn't just stop there. He goes on and talks about something that's a higher level concept than classic versus romantic. The word unify here is mine, but basically the message of the book is that quality, which you could take to be excellence or goodness, or if you were a classic mindset, you might take it to be truth, the thing that we pursue, is in fact a higher level concept than either the classic or the romantic perspectives. And that in fact takes a combination of the analytical and the intuitive, of the rational, the mystic, to define quality. And so that's a theme that I'd like to draw through a little bit in terms of network architecture. There certainly is a lot of analysis that goes into it, but at the end of the day, analysis isn't sufficient. Another way that you can think about it is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. If you simply added subcomponent A and subcomponent B and subcomponent C and declared that to be your architecture, you'd sort of missed the point. It's really, the gestalt of the architecture is bigger than the sum of its parts. Another way of thinking about it is that when you look at an architecture, there's actually more to its potential than its measurable impact at the moment. So these are all themes I'm going to try to pull through. And at this point, you might think, he's finally done trying to draw the Buddhist metaphor through network architecture, but I'm in fact just getting started. I'm not a practicing Buddhist. I read some wisdom acquired through life experiences. But as I started to think about it a little bit, I saw enough parallels, and I'm going to use it as a narrative. So think of this as a narrative. And if you see some conflicts or some opportunities that I missed, I'd be happy to hear about them. All right, so where to begin? Beginning. Buddhism's first noble truth: life is suffering. Okay? Well, this means something a little bit different to Buddhists than it might if you haven't seen it before. Suffering is really about dissatisfaction. It's not necessarily a depressive thing. It's really a quite uplifting idea. But at its face, this one hit home really hard. This is where you're supposed to laugh. Thanks. So, I was involved for several years on the work that was behind the Genie project. I'm not affiliated with Genie today, and Life is Suffering equals Genie is not a commentary on any of the technical decisions made by the people that have been pushing Genie forward. However, if you interpret suffering as dissatisfaction, that there's always something more, then it applies head-on. Because it was a matter of, a good test bed isn't enough. We have to do a test bed times 100, then clearly that's going to be much, much better. And that really was one of the things that got Genie in trouble, I think, a little bit, is it was trying to be everything to everybody and to satisfy everybody's needs and requirements. But there's another important message that I take from this, and that is, quite often when we approach subjects, our dissatisfaction actually comes from the fact that we try to divide the world into categories. Okay, the Buddhists, I think, would call this the duality, something to be avoided. And in fact, the strongest thing that came through for me in working on the Genie Initiative for the first couple of years that happened was I was completely taken back by the division in the community, or should I say the division between two communities, which I can call the networking community and the distributed systems community, because they have entirely different perspectives of what Genie ought to be. And just in a nutshell, the distributed systems perspective is the internet's perfectly fine. All the interesting stuff will be built on top of it. And the networking perspective, of course, was that all of the interesting stuff is how I get the packets from point A to point B and do interesting stuff to those packets en route. And the tension between those two views was really the very hardest thing that made Genie a much less fun thing to be involved in. And so, again, I'm going to take that lesson forward. And again, the duality idea is the same one that I was talking about before, which was classic, romantic, this, that, networking distributed system. These are the issues, these are the things that can get us into trouble. And in fact, the thing that you do when you realize that is you look for a middle way. That is to say, it's neither this or that. You try to seek unifying abstractions. This involves both, back to Persick's book, analysis and intuition. And it involves balancing requirements. And I think this is probably the most important thing. It's not about optimizing any one dimension, which is the analytical way of approaching the problem. It's about balancing requirements. Now, through the course of the talk, I'm going to, I think, identify 3 papers that I suspect you haven't read because they're either unpublished or hard to find. You can get to them at my homepage. I put them up there so that you can go track them down. The first one, which I'm quite sure you didn't read because it was never published anywhere, but it is in fact that I view as the sweat and toil of the couple of years spent on Genie before it was turned into a project that BB and the GPO run, was the Genie Design Principles, or Genie Design Document 0608 from August of 2006. And I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but if you go take a look at that, what you'll find is it identified 11 requirements, or 11 dimensions along which one might want to build a networking/distributed systems test bed. And then said, oh, but they are not necessarily complementary, there are in fact many tensions. You can't have all 11 at the same time. And if what you're about is, of course, optimizing getting one of those 11, then you're going to run into some significant tensions. And so it chose a point in the space by identifying a set of 7 rules for resolving inter-requirement tensions. So you can kind of think of those as precedents or priorities placed upon the requirements. And sort of the combination of those rules or ordering priorities and the requirements, I think, effectively define that architecture. When in Hong Kong. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about the path to enlightenment in the context of network architecture. And the Buddhist path, I believe, has eight principles to it. They aren't so much a sequence of 8 steps as 8 principles, I would think of them. But one way of thinking about this is that the whole business of dissatisfaction and life is suffering is that we throw up illusions that worlds that we live in mentally that don't allow us to see reality. And a lot of what the practice, as I understand it, is finding ways to break down those blinders to keep you from seeing reality. Because when you see reality, then you eventually get to nirvana. And it's the tricks we play with on ourselves to keep us from seeing reality that, in fact, are the limiting factors in our lives. Well, I'm going to transpose this into ideas, which is the coin that we work in our business. And so I'm going to look through, I think I have 6 steps here, to think of this as the maturity of the ideas, or if you will, of the path to enlightenment for your ideas. So we start with some inspiration, I would argue. Quite often that's the intuitive part of the situation. And we sometimes do analysis. We run some simulations, maybe we do some analytical work, and we judge the feasibility of the idea, the suitability of the idea. And of course, a lot of people who call themselves systems people will take the next step, and they'll do controlled lab experiments. Well, whoops. This is a way of seeing the implementation reality. It might in fact be that it was a perfectly good idea, but if you try to implement it, it's not going to behave in quite the way that you wanted it to. And so that's a pulling away the blinders. There's a little implementation reality. And you modify your ideas, and it matures. Then the next thing you might do is an deployment study. And this is where, of course, Planet Lab came into play. You now had a place to not just test your idea in the lab, but you could test it out in the real world. And as a consequence, you saw reality a little bit more clearly because now you saw traffic and user reality. And that was the story of Planet Lab for quite some time. And again, there were a lot of people who took advantage of that, and they built services, and they ran them on Planet Lab, and they learned lots of things about the way the real world works, the way traffic really impacts these services, and the way users actually use the services. What we discovered, so this story you maybe anticipated, what we discovered was that we really still only knew so much. And there was a thing that you could do beyond the deployment study, which I'm going to call a pilot demonstration, which went beyond simply running a service on something like Planet Lab, but actually trying to find a customer and talk to them and say, what are your requirements? What would it take for you to run this service? And so this gives you some customer reality. And I'll talk a little in a few minutes about my particular experience here, but when you have customers telling you what they want, as opposed to just imagining for yourself what this thing ought to do, you actually see quite a bit more truth in this than you saw before. Then, of course, if you have any luck there, you might get to commercial adoption. And now suddenly you're faced with market realities, which are a quite different thing, because now you've got lots of customers, and you're competing with lots of competition. And you, again, see things a little bit more clearly. And based upon what you learn through the market realities, quite often there's an opportunity to change the market, or change the paradigm, change the way things are done. So real quickly, let me take you on that same sequence, specifically with Planet Lab and Coblitz, which was Planet Lab, the platform, Coblitz, one of the services that run on top of Planet Lab. This is work with Vivek Pai and Kyung-Soo Park. First of all, notice the timeline. I'm now talking about approximately a 12-year period. So in terms of fast turnaround in time for the next conference deadline, this is in a completely different time space here. Back in 2002, we did the simulations. We wrote a paper. Okay, that was the business. You do a simulation, you write a paper. We did an implementation. We did some micro benchmarks. We ran it on Planet Lab, and from an academic point of view, we thought that was a pretty good success because every time we ran it, we figured out something that we didn't understand before, and we redid it, and we added capabilities, and we added features, and we iterated there for quite some time. A sequence of papers came out of that, so from an academic point of view, it was a success, but we also learned enough more that we then realized we then had an opportunity to take the idea to a pilot demonstration. And specifically, there happened to be a Planet Lab partner, Polish Telecom, that thought they had customers that would be interested in Coblitz. I guess I should stop and say for a second, Coblitz is a scalable CDN technology, so it's a set of caches, a request rather than sends you the right cache. The cache is scaled in cluster as a cluster in the performance. And so Polish Telecom said, let's install this in our telco, and we have customers, they're media companies within Poland, that will be pilot customers of this, and we learned a lot through doing that. And in fact, it got to the point that we then took that commercial. We sold it to telcos and eventually sold the technology to Akamai so they could sell it to telcos. Each one of these was a 2-year period of time, give or take. Okay, so there's obviously a large investment. I'm certainly not claiming this is the only way to commercial success. There are lots of different kinds of companies and lots of different ways of doing things. But one of the things you learn in the telco business is that there's very long timelines, and things move very slowly, until they need to move very, very quickly, and then suddenly they can. So the question is, what about changing the market? And I think there's an opportunity there. I'm going to briefly mention, I'm going to come back in a little bit in more detail. The first way to change the market is now every operator, every cable company and every telco has or will have their own CDN. So we're used to thinking of CDNs as a global thing, Akamai being one of those companies. But in fact, every telco out there and every ISP will have its own CDN. And now that leads to an opportunity to interconnect CDNs. Not unlike interconnecting autonomous systems to build internet, you can now build an inter-CDN connect. And in fact, there's an IETF working group looking at exactly that issue. And it certainly has, there's pairwise agreements, there could be global and local agreements, local global agreements. There's all kinds of opportunities there, but it's an absolute change in the market as a consequence of getting that technology into telco's hands. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the other, which is virtualized commodity servers at the edge. So the way I like to think about this is that CDNs, the technology they fundamentally grew out of the IT world, finding its way into the telco world. And talk about duality, those are two completely different perspectives on the world. And that technology was delivered on commodity servers running virtualization software. And now that you have those servers with a CDN, a cache in one virtual machine, you might start thinking about what do I put in the other virtual machines. And I'm not necessarily claiming a cause and effect here, but there was a lot of synergy between where the telcos are and were wanting to take advantage of the same cloud technology that the Googles of the world were taking advantage of, but do it out at the edge of their networks. CDNs are a driving application for that technology. In fact, they generalized it and started calling it network function virtualization. They couldn't call it network virtualization because that would just be a virtual network. This is network function virtualization. You take what used to be a hardware appliance and you run it in a virtual machine. But that's just the first step. And that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit more. This is complementary to SDN, but it's not the same thing. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So this is the picture I'd like to have for you to have in your mind as I go forward. This is just a canonical operator network, now populated with commodity processors. And so we've got some larger data centers, one or more, connected to the backbone, which at every one of the writing centers probably has at least some amount of computing capacity, connected to the edge, the very edge, and now I'm talking about the operator's edge. I'm not necessarily talking about what's in your home, although you could take it that far. But again, you have less capacity there. So now that you have these commodity processors, you start placing the functions on those processors. That's network function virtualization. So we did a proof of concept. This is now before the Akamai part of it. We were a small startup called VeraView, and we worked with BT, who was way out in front in my view on this, and collaborated really with Intel and HP. And as a first demonstration, we took BRAS, which is the thing that over your broadband connection you connect into when you connect into BT's network. And we ran that into some virtual machines, and we could scale those up with more virtual machines as we had load. And we ran the CDN in another virtual machine. And we just demonstrated that that was entirely feasible, and the performance is perfectly fine. Well, BRAS has got some issues, and in fact, BT backed off of that. And they're doing a second round where they're coupling the CDN technology with video quality applications, QoS applications. And they're doing another set of examples where the virtual machines are running what you would think of as sort of middle box functions, the sort of functions that enterprises would want. But they're pushing wholeheartedly in this, and I think the entire industry is behind it. And I think it is very much the way of the future. I'm going to come back again a little bit later and talk about that in more detail, but I just wanted to set the context for it to start with. So what I take away from that experience is that it's essential to see reality clearly. Assumptions that we have hide the truth. So assumptions make the problem simpler. It makes it feasible to do analytic solutions, for example, but that doesn't necessarily mean that with the truth. I think we all understand that. Pulling away the assumptions is as critical as seeing the reality. And users, it turns out, reveal the truth faster than any other phenomena that I know of. You put a function out there, and then you see how it's used. And it's always in unexpected ways. And the key, in my view, is to operationalize the work that we're doing. So this is a term I had not heard until about 2 months ago, and now every talk I hear from industry has the word operationalize in it. And usually has OpenStack as the object of the sentence. But I would argue this is going to become the new bar. And it really ought to. Because we have infrastructure as a service out there now. You can go get virtual machines for on the cheap, and you can bring the services and the things that you create in the lab up and try to get users. And if you do something that is useful, you will get users. And maybe your users will be other researchers, but operationalizing your service is a step that you can take, and I would argue that ought to be the new bar. Not for every piece of work, obviously, but it ought to be something that we aspire to. And the important point to take away is that deploying and operating our ideas is as much of an advance over simply implementing them as implementing is over the thought experiment. And it ought to be something that the community figures out a way to embrace, and by that I mean figures out a way to reward, both in terms of funding and in terms of publications, because that is the currency for the academic community. One final point, and then I'm going to get to some meatier stuff. There's so many opportunities here to play with the laws of thermodynamics and the noble truths of Buddhism, but I'm just going to stop short and just talk about entropy for just a minute, which I believe is actually quite consistent with Buddhism. But I'm going to define entropy just a little bit different than you may have heard before. Entropy is a measure of engineering's effect on architecture. I had not fully understood this until I moved from an academic setting into a commercial setting, into an industry setting. Engineering has its own mindset. Architects build beautiful things, and then engineers destroy them. Somewhat of a dramatization of the situation. Tracy Kidder, who wrote The Soul of a New Machine, has another book called House. I think it's called House, which is about the tension between construction and architects. It's exactly the same tensions between engineers and architects in that work. Highly recommend that book. So what really drove this point home to me, I was having a conversation with an engineer about a feature we needed to add to the product. This is the CDN product. And we're going back and forth as the right way to solve the problem. And at one point I said, you can't do that. And he said, sure I can. It's a simple matter of programming. I said, no, the architecture says you can't do that. And he just looked at me like I was speaking a completely different language. All right? The expediency of solving a problem as an engineer trumps what you think the design ought to be, even if that design gave that product longer lifetime. I mean, there was an argument as to why the architecture was as it was. It's because you're going to face all kinds of 11 dimensions worth of conflicting requirements, and you have to balance those as you move forward. And if you try to optimize along any one to solve a particular feature request that some customer's giving you today, then you're going to screw that story up somewhere down the line. Doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is this is what I need to do today, and this is the fix I'm going to make. It's a simple matter of programming. Well, that got me to thinking, what exactly, of course, is an architecture? Again, I would go back to Dave Clark saying at one point, an architecture tells you what you can't do. Well, I just told the engineer what he couldn't do, and he didn't listen. All right, so there's got to be a little something more to it. How do you tell the engineer what not to do? Well, you can write down some design principles. And so I think I'm pointing to a paper that Rafi and I wrote for Planet Lab, and it laid out what we thought were the design principles. It acknowledged that Planet Lab was going to be a dynamic system, and we didn't have all the answers on day one, and it was going to evolve over time. It acknowledged that, and it said, when you encounter a problem that looks like this, then you should tend towards the following kind of solution. And it wasn't just the platitudes of good, best practices. It applied it very specifically to what Planet Lab was trying to be. And we didn't give root out, super user privilege, so therefore we could say no to engineers. So that was a little bit different setting. But what I did learn in the corporate setting was engineers don't read design documents. They know what the code is, and they know how to fix the code to meet features. So this got me to thinking, what exactly is it? And how do you manifest an architecture? What is it? Well, there's a fixed point. There's got to be something there that's fixed. What exactly is that? Well, circa 1981, it was an ASCII rendering of a protocol header. It looked like this, and we fixed that. And we've done all kinds of evolution around that, including a pretty significant amount of engineering that the architects that caused a lot of architects to cringe. So I'm not arguing necessarily that systems shouldn't bend to the pressures of the engineering, simply that you'd like to give that architecture a fighting chance, all right? And that the entropy not happen too quickly. that there are some good ideas there, that they have a time to prove themselves. And so, we certainly have principles that go along with the internet. The end-to-end argument is a prime example. So we had a fixed point, a protocol header, and we had some design principles. Well, I would argue that today, and I'm using network architecture very generally, and if you haven't guessed by now, network architecture for me is a synonym for abstractions. It's a Django class, object class definition. If everything you do in engineering has to be represented in an object class that's part of a user interface, then the engineers walk around with a dog-eared copy of the data model for the system they're working in, and they need to add a feature. There's implementation decisions get made, absolutely, but those implementation decisions have to be represented in a way that's consistent with the data model. And I'm going to choose Django, the D is silent, as one example implementation for a data model. This happens to be the slice abstraction that we're using in a new version of what used to be called ClientLab, and I'll get to in a second. So at least this gives you, as an architect, a place to focus on to exercise quality control if you have that opportunity. And again, there can be many people involved in those decisions. It's not like you're necessarily the architect becomes the dictator of the system, but at least there's a coherent single place that you can go talk about the changes that are being made in the system. Because until you have that, it's a little bit of code here, a little bit of code there, and a little bit of code over here, and you basically, the system dissipates very, very quickly. So, pull away some lessons. Architecture is part analysis and part intuition. And I strongly believe that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. You cannot simply go and measure, oh, you did X, you did Y, you did Z. Those have been published. What's new? It's the synthesis of those ideas that I think is quite often the value. Second, it's all about unifying abstractions. And I would argue anytime you have a tension that you recognize, a duality, that is in fact your opportunity to do something creative, innovative, and potentially important. As you do it, you're going to be balancing requirements, and it's certainly not about optimizing any one dimension. It has to be experience-driven. You cannot develop architectures in a vacuum. They are not thought experiments. You can think of an architecture as a hypothesis that over time will be vetted. But when you decide about an architecture, you don't have the luxury of the hindsight of that time. It's a collective intuition and wisdom of what you've seen before that goes into it. You have to deploy it, operationalize it, and actually use it before you know if it was a good idea. And that you have to plan for the evolution of that system. It's absolutely going to evolve. And that means defining the principles and invariants. It's not just the schematic box diagram, it's the principles that get applied to the potential changes to those block diagrams that's critical. This is we're going to check the time. And we're going to do something different now. Thank goodness you're saying. That was all retrospective looking back. And I gave you some number of lessons. What I'm going to do now is put those lessons to action. And so I'm going to bend your tolerance. I'm going to think out loud. This is a problem that I've been struggling with over the last few weeks. And what you're going to see in the next half hour is a snapshot of where I am with it today. And I'm happy to take feedback on it and all the questions you have. This happens to be the question having to do with how do you think about software-defined networking, separating the control plane from the data plane, network function virtualization, putting data plane functions in virtual machines and commodity processors in the middle of the network, and what we've started to learn from people that are building scalable cloud applications. Let's just call those apps for short. And by app, I don't necessarily just mean what runs on your phone. I mean the stuff that's behind it in the data center as well. Well, applications run on top of the network. SDN is separation control of data, and NFV is putting functions in the data plane. What is the relationship between those, and how should I think about them? This is a personal interest to me. I've recently joined the Open Networking Lab, which you may know of all the Open Networking Star Foundation, Summit, and so on that Guru, Nick McEwen, and Scott Shanker have been involved in. So I'm joining them as chief architect. And You can think of this as a corporate merger between two nonprofits, Planet Lab and the Open Networking Lab. And so we're trying to think about all the experience that we have in both of those domains and how do you bring them together to build something bigger and better than we could build before. All right, so that's the problem that I'm trying to think about. And for the next couple of slides, I'm just going to try to give you some ways of thinking about this problem, just some observations that I've made as I've struggled to make sense of this. First of all, it strikes me that this is a distinction without a difference. There's just three different implementation points for network functions, functions meaning code. All three, SDN, NFV, and apps. Those are just three different terms that we use for a function. And they might get implemented in different places in the network, but the place that you're implemented shouldn't have anything to do fundamentally with how you talk about that particular function. And in fact, as you look at any pair of them, the line is extremely blurred, at least for me. So the blurring of the SDN application line is a proxy that cuts through uninteresting flows, a controller. So take a web proxy. Is that an application or is it a controller? What if that proxy looks at some packets that goes by and says, I can't do anything for this particular flow. I want to speak to the router sitting next to me and have him just cut those packets through directly to the server. I don't want to proxy those packets. A lot of people think about a proxy as in the application space. It runs, quote, on top of the network, and yet it's acted as a controller of SDN in an SDN sort of way. Well, what if we start with a controller? In fact, the Open Networking Lab has built a prototype controller that's supposed to scale. How did it do that? It leveraged the scalable service, Cassandra in this particular case, as a prototype. So is a scalable controller that uses a NoSQL database and application, or is it a controller? Again, the line is blurred. It's probably a distinction without a difference. A CDN. That's an application from the definition that runs on top of the network. Again, this is kind of like an example of a proxy, but it actually might be the kind of application that actually wants to control the network because it manages a caching hierarchy. And you could give it SDN-esque control over the underlying networks. So is it an application or is it a controller? The line for me is extremely blurred. The line between network function virtualization and applications is also very blurred. We think of NFV as, quote, in the data plane. So again, is a proxy in the data plane or is it an application? Is your definition that you made it up through TCP and then back down? Or is it actually processing on the IP packets? I mean, how do you draw that distinction and why would it be important? And finally, blurring the line between NFV and SDN for me is quite blurred, but in kind of a good way. So is a firewall in the data plane or is it the control plane? The answer is, of course, it's both. And that's an important observation because it basically says the function, the network function, has a data plane aspect and it has a control aspect. And that's an important observation, but for any function you can make that argument, arguably. All right, that was my first observation, that these are potentially distinctions without a difference. I want to sort of get a second picture in your head, and that's having to do with topology. I mean, ultimately, we all have network graphs in our heads. That's the way we think. And I need to figure out what the building blocks of those graphs are. So here's one building block. We have a virtual topology that's mapped onto a physical topology. This is, in fact, the value add of a network virtualization layer. It gives you topology isolation, it gives you behavior isolation, it gives you address space isolation. And so there have been some very successful companies out there building network virtualization layers. It is a very important corner of the space to be working in. But keep in mind that from a virtual topology point of view, much as networkers, we like interesting graphs. From an application point of view, big switches are a really attractive network. Okay, that's the internet. It's a big switch. Everybody's connected to everybody. The internet manages, gives you the virtual topology. As we reinvent the internet through the lens of SDN, we just need to remember that big switches are still a pretty good abstraction. But whether it's a more complicated graph or not, maybe for a caching hierarchy, it's a little bit more sophisticated. That may be true. the network virtualization plays a critical role here. Well, once we have, so I'm not going to postulate that there are some functions. I'll talk about those in a second, but I needed to do this picture first. If you think of a function as a place that you go do some computing off of the switch, and now that switch could be virtual or physical. So you pass to the switch and you route forward up to the function, you do some computing, and you come back down. So that's my paradigm. That's a topology that is extremely common. In fact, that is the essence of the application. It sits on top of the network. You exit the network, you do something, you come back into the network. Well, there are two optimizations that we perform on that particular idiom. One of them is the cut-through optimization, where the function says, never mind, I don't need to see those packets anymore, cut them through. Right? That's just an optimization that we can sometimes perform. We have the appropriate interfaces. Another optimization is what I call the inline optimization, which says, don't pop it up to me so I compute, put it in line. Now, the implementation could be different. It could be a bump-in-the-wire hardware appliance. I'm going to add some latency, but it's just a bump in the wire, and I have a sequence of functions concatenated together. That's basically standard practice. NFV is about taking that function and sticking it in a commodity processor instead of a purpose-built piece of hardware. So think of F as potentially implemented by a commodity processor, but it's still a bump in the wire in this model. But there's another implementation point here, which is that function actually lives, let's say, in the line card, or maybe in the general purpose processor inside of the switch. That's a potentially useful implementation. That's a software runner. But in any case, you can think of that as an optimization of what we have in the first picture. I approached this thinking, what are the optimizations you perform in a function? After I do this picture, it wasn't until after I do it that I realized that I had just drawn a picture of an app, the first one. Cut through gets you to SDN, and inline gets you to network function virtualization. So the two optimizations that we're performing are effectively to get data getting a function out of the data plane and putting a function in a faster place in the data plane. Of those two optimizations. Let me talk about the function just for a second, and then I'm going to pull it all together. We talk quite often about scaling functions, scaling a service. And that means serving, as you get more users, this comes right out of what the cloud is good for, what the data center is good for. You scale a service by just throwing a larger number of processors or virtual machines at it. And because the functions are self-load balancing and self-healing and elastic and all those wonderful things, it just works. But I wanted to put this picture up as sort of the cloud version of that, and then make sure you understand that there is the edge version of exactly the same thing. Some functions get scaled by putting them at the edge. So now the question is reduced to, do I scale a function by putting it at the edge, or do I scale a function by bunching it up on a stack in a rack in the data center? And it all comes down to, can I tolerate the latency? Do I have sufficient bandwidth from the edge back? Do I have sufficient capacity at the edge? I've got only so many cycles there because remember we've got 2 boxes there, we've got 10 boxes back here. Whatever the numbers are, there's going to be limited capacity at the edge. And do those functions have shared state across flows? If there's no shared state or a minimal state, I can put the function at the edge. As soon as there's shared state, I'm going to need to put the function back in the data center because that's where I'm going to manage the shared state. But the question as to where the function goes simply reduces to the number crunching analysis. In this case, there is no intuition required. Right? This one can be resolved. And of course, there's a version of this which is the very, very, very edge, which is actually hardware, but that's just a special case. And of course, there could be multiple points in between because there could be a hierarchy of cloud capability between the edge and back. All right, so in my pictures from here on, a function is a scalable, my f is going to be a scalable function. And I can scale it either in the data center or I can scale it at the edge. Oh, by the way, there's an interesting question here, which is how do you partition functions into data center subroutines and edge subroutines? And that's kind of like how you separate the control from the data in the firewall example. But I think that's going to become a critical function as we move forward and our clouds move out of the data center and encompass everything to the edge as well. Okay, so with those observations, I'm going to refactor the space. Everything, all network functions, I'm going to call a scalable service, just to pick a neutral term for fourth term here. The distinction between an application and controller and a network function virtualization is entirely arbitrary by my definition. Everything's a scalable service. SDN is a technology that's going to help us bootstrap the virtualization layer. And that's going to give me virtual networks. And those virtual networks are going to be isolated from each other. So I can have one and you can have one and they don't interfere. And there's going to be a piece of the system that manages that virtual topology to physical topology mapping. And if you've attended any, at least in industry, I'm not sure if it's the same in academia, but in industry, if you ever go to an SDN meeting, there's an undercurrent of, did you do that with tunnels or did you do it with OpenFlow? And I quite frankly don't care. All right? Those are two implementation techniques, both of which are perfectly valid in different settings. I'm going to postulate that we're going to have an optimization available to us in this virtual network virtualization layer. And that's going to take a hint from the service, which implements the function, telling it that it can apply an optimization. This optimization is suitable now. In this model of the world, network function virtualization reduces to an implementation choice. Does it actually make sense to put this function at the edge based upon the analysis I was talking about, the very quantifiable analysis I was talking about a minute ago? Yes or no? NFV is an optimization. SDN is a bootstrap. It's not the only time I may use SDN. I may have network services that in fact want to control the network, and that's my service head. But this is my grand unified theory of how these pieces all fit together. Which leads me to my punchline, which is that everything is a service. We've got IaaS, we've got PaaS, we now have Exes, rhymes with texts. Everything is a service. The unified abstraction is a service. It unifies across resources. You don't have to get caught in the debate between, is it a compute-centric view of the world or is it a network-centric view of the world? I step to a higher plane and I talk about services that involve a lot of different resources. It is, just sort of as an aside, I've been amazed at when you get into conversations, depending on whether you're talking to a networking person or a scalable application person who thinks compute first or network first. They try to bring the discussion into their worldview. I think you have to step above both of those worldviews and think in terms of services. It unifies across the entire network, from the data center to the WAN to the edge, wherever you want to put the edge. It is all the cloud. I think that we're doing ourselves a disservice by thinking of the cloud as the data center only. It is increasingly going to become the data center to the very edge. Service, there's a function placement problem, but that's an implementation choice. Fundamentally, services run across the entire network. And it's going to also unify across service levels. I think infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service are artificial bundlings of everything as a service. And I'll show you a couple pictures of that in a minute. But I think we're at risk of siloing, in terms of people building silos in this space, because there's a very few number of players who are able to say, this is your platform, take it or leave it. While at the same time, there are dozens and dozens of different services that can be bundled in different ways for different purposes. Well, if I've got this abstraction, I'm going to need an operating system for it, or I'm going to call it an operating system. I'm going to call it XOS. It defines service as a first-class object. It supports managing services, not servers. It supports seamless service extension. If you have a service, it becomes part of the operating system. Think about your use of an operating system. You don't ever think about, maybe you do, but most people don't think about, is that part of the kernel or not? It's part of the operating system. And the point here is that you build services, they add to the whole, and it ought to be possible to explicitly support that. It integrates service orchestration with provisioning. There's actually a potential interplay between acquiring the resources and meeting the objectives of the service, and you have to accommodate both of those views at the same time. And I think very critically it supports both service isolation and service composition. We understand isolation because we've been building multi-tenant data centers. Your service is separate from mine. And if you go into a telco, they are the extreme example of applying isolation to everything that they put into the networks. You tell them exactly which ports you have open on exactly what function, and there are firewall rules ad nauseum to make sure everything's isolated from each other. And yet, if everything is a service, the way you build services is by leveraging existing services, and that's going to require service composition. And so you have to simultaneously support composition and isolation. So real quickly, a service abstraction, I understand, is a bit of a vague term. It's a well-defined function. I'm going to claim it supports probably a RESTful interface. It's available network-wide. I don't think about it as location-specific. That's part of the implementation. It's all the wonderful things of the cloud. It's scalable, it's elastic, it's resilient because of all the adoption of best practices. It runs in a set of virtual machines connected by one or more virtual networks. Some of those virtual networks may be interconnected for the sake of composition. Some of them will be isolated. And I build new services by composing with existing services. This is a standard way of building software systems. And I'm just sort of as an aside, I'm just going to point out that some services are building blocks, like an OSQL database. Some are user-facing, and some are both. That's perfectly fine. So some examples of service composition. Real quickly, Koblitz actually was a set of multiple services that got used in different combinations for different purposes. There was the caching piece, the request router piece, and the intercept server piece that we used for transparent caching, but it just intercepted connections and then referred them to the cache. So those were two separate functions. Syndicate is a project one of my students is working on, which I'm going to say just a tiny bit more, but basically think of it as it builds a global object store by taking the best of data center storage, which is persistence and durability, the best of CDNs, which is aggregate capacity at the edge, and adds to it the coherence. You need to make it a read-write store. And in this particular case, we use a NoSQL database, and literally we use Google App Engine to build a scalable version of the coherence. But that's the combination of the cache, which we call HPC, request router, some number of back-end data center stores, S3, Dropbox, whatever, and a NoSQL database. It's like 4 or 5 different services in combination gives you Syndicate. Third is another example that's a scalable monitoring and analytics service, and it's built by a munging together of Storm, Cassandra, RabbitMQ, and Zookeeper, if you know those software packages. But again, it's a combination of services in aggregate to build a new service. So Syndicate, I'm not going to spend enough time on this, but basically you can think of there being all these wonderful persistent stores. You can think of there being some perfectly good data sets out there, GeneBank, Common Crawl, the MLab data set, lots of data sets out there. And you've got users with their local disks and their local clusters. And by putting the appropriate gateway in place, in very quick glossy, I get to treat the caching that's available in the network as my common transport. And so now these blue boxes are in fact Syndicate, and it's very, that's a very, very modest amount of code, is translating everything between the external file system space, object store space, and HTTP and URIs. And it's doing that in a way that with the help of a metadata service running on a NoSQL database, you can keep the data consistent, even though it's in the cache. So you aren't fighting the cache, you're actually leveraging the cache over time. Again, I understand that's a very quick introduction to this, but the point is you can build services through the aggregation of existing services, and everybody gets to see a common abstraction. When you do that, the network now looks like this. Every one of the switch-looking things is a big switch. It's a virtual network. And it could be more than a big switch, but I'm just going to keep it simple. It's a big switch. And every function is a scalable service. It scales across however many virtual machines it needs to, and those virtual machines are placed wherever they need to be placed. And whenever two services are connected to a virtual network, that means they compose. They can talk to each other. The virtual machines and both of those, it's an aggregation of the virtual machines that are part of both services that can communicate over that virtual network. Some are public-facing, some are hidden. In this particular example, request router, cache, Syndicate, metadata service, and object store. An operator is going to put their object store back on a private network because they want no customers to get to it. You can only get through it through the caching service that sits in front of it. That's just an example of how you hide one service behind another. So that's the content acquisition network in this particular example. And I could have done the same thing for third, and any system that you want to build. This is the way that I'm now thinking about the union of all those things. So quickly, the X operating system is now a RESTful API and a data model and a controller, model view controller, paradigm. Everything is a service. The set of services in the middle, compute as a service, network as a service, identity management as a service. There's a bootstrap. I can't do anything too interesting until I have at least those three. The bundle of those three is infrastructure as a service. But I've got a large set of object stores as a service built from parts, analytics as a service built from parts. They're all services from the point of view of XOS. Of course, there's some virtualization technology under the covers, Open vSwitch, OpenFlow enabled switches, libvirt is an interface to all kinds of different machine virtualization technologies. Those are the parts. The data model, services running one or more, I'm going to use slices to allow me that. They extend the data, you can extend the data model with service-specific objects, and you define a shim so that programs can access them. That gives you the platformness of the system. A slice is just a resource container, a set of VMs and a set of virtual networks. I'm going to do a constraint-based virtual machine placement. Virtual machines can come and go over time, and I can isolate networks from each other. I can combine them together, and the virtual machines can talk to each other. It's the basic model of the system. Where each VM is a big switch that fully connects all the VMs in the slice. They can be public or private. They can be open or closed. It is shared or not shared. Those are all attributes of the virtual networks. All right, so just a couple more slides to tie it all together. I claimed that you had to operationalize. I got to operationalize this. It's not enough to draw the slideware. To me, operationalization means you take a pile of code, which OpenStack probably gives you. So we're going to operationalize OpenStack with the policies, configuration, and workflows that codify our operational practices and usage models. And here I'm pointing to a paper that talks about the operational practices of Planet Lab, which did come to bear a little bit on what we're doing here. We have hardware, so we're going to leverage it. We actually have 5 data centers worth of processors. And by data center, I mean multiple racks, but not tens of thousands of machines. They all have SDN top of rack. Internet 2 is deploying SDN OpenFlow capable switches throughout their backbone, and we have processors in the middle of Internet 2's backbone at the routing centers. And we have a whole bunch of edge sites, an increasing number of which are SDN capable. So this is my hardware for the pilot of the system, which I'm going to call OpenCloud. So I'm pulling together, this is the project that the Open Networking Lab and Planet Lab are now jointly undertaking. So we've got pilot hardware, we have pilot software. I've already basically spilled the beans on this. This is basically taking the pieces that we get from OpenStack, which you're familiar with. Gives you, again, a pile of components, but everyone is understanding that's not enough to build a cloud. You have to operationalize it, so that's in fact the data model that sits on top of it. We're adding a virtualization layer, OpenVertex being built by the Open Networking Lab, and that will lead to a plug into Quantum. Everything that's got kind of green around the edges means we're trying to be OpenStack compliant. And that's the pilot software that we're going to be deploying sometime soon. So the status is near term. We have an initial prototype of this that's running in the lab, and we hope to get it running on the hardware that I told you about a second ago. We're going to deploy the exemplar services because I don't think we can learn anything until we have those services running on it. And then we're going to, down the road, integrate the OpenVertex when it's available. Longer term, there's a ton of interesting research questions. What are the right abstractions? How do I think about software routers versus the model I just put forward? I think there's a very clear meaning in the middle between those two ways of thinking about things. How is functionality best split between the data center and the edge? And what's the performance impact of service composition? There's going to be a performance impact. Latency is an increasing issue in the data center as well. We really need to address that, but I don't think that's a reason to not tackle this problem. So this is something that we're doing. I'd be happy to talk to you about your involvement. It's sort of a re-engineering and a rethinking about what we were doing with Planet Lab to make it relevant to the data center to edge cloud that's emerging. So, trying to think what wonderful conclusions I can draw from all of this. It's an interesting problem and I'm enjoying it. It doesn't feel at all like Genie. I've already talked about the lessons about network architecture. So it occurs to me there's exactly one conclusion that I can draw, which is simply that I indebted to very many people, including the ones I could fit on this slide. Apologies to anyone that didn't fit on this slide, but the folks here, it's not strictly Planet Lab. There's actually quite a wide set of people that I learned from, benefited from, had enjoyable conversations with over the last 12 years of this experiment. And I would certainly like to thank all of them. And because I always fail to do this, the National Science Foundation has been very generous in their support. And I apologize for not doing that on a reading talk and a paper I do. So with that, I think I will stop and see if there are any questions.